Hello, Wazobia Code developers. Welcome back to Wazobia Code. The last video introduced you to simple JSX. In this lecture, we will be learning about React components and props. In React, a component is like a building block for your website. Each component represents a small part of your website, like a button, a picture, or a whole section of the page. You can create components and reuse them in different places. And you can combine all of those components together to build your entire website. Components make it easy to organize and manage your code because you can break down your website into smaller, understandable parts and you can easily reuse them. So, for example, you could have your website page and then you could create a reusable header component and add that to the homepage. Then maybe you have a form inside the homepage. You could make a component for that as well and then add it into the homepage. Hmm. Lastly, maybe you wanted a footer inside your homepage as well. You make a component for the footer and then you add it into your homepage. And then what you have done now is that you've created three different components, a header, a form, and a footer, and you've added them into the homepage of your website. Just because you've created these components, they exist throughout your entire website and they can be reused on different pages. So, for example, you could actually use the same components inside your website sign-in page. So that is the idea behind components. They are just reusable pieces of code that add pieces of your website, and then you can use them on multiple pages over and over again. So this is the Replit homepage. We are going to create a new repo, create new repo. And remember, we're working with React, so the template is going to be React JavaScript. If you don't see it here, all you just need to do is search React JavaScript. And then let's give our repo a name. We are going to call it recipe sharing. So this is going to be an application that we are going to keep building with the further lessons. So this is going to be a repo that you have to treat special. We're going to tell you the changes you're going to make to it. Don't make any other changes. We're going to guide you to making a good recipe sharing app. So let's create the repo. Okay, good. And then we have our auto-generated files. In the previous video, I explained all of these files. If you haven't watched the previous video, you should, because it explains what all these files do. Okay, so when we hit run, we can see on the right hand side, this is the page that the code makes. So what we're going to do is go into the app.jsx file, and we're actually going to delete the text, and then our page is going to be empty. Do not delete the HTML tag, because when you delete the HTML tag, that is going to cause an error. Let me show you that right now. So if you delete only the HTML tag, you're going to notice that that causes an error because we have an empty return. So leave the HTML tag, but delete the content of it. So what is the plan for this repo? We want to make a recipe sharing website. So in this website, you can log in and then see instructions and ingredients for different foods, and you can add the instructions and ingredients for a new food. So let us create our first component. It will contain the recipe name, recipe descriptions, ingredients for the recipe, and instructions on how to make the recipe. We are going to create this new component inside the SRC folder, add a file. We're going to call it recipe details.jsx. And there you go. We've started the file. And now we're going to write code to create our new component. It's going to look very similar to app.jsx because app.jsx is a component as well. So, what is the first thing we have to do? Well, remember, a component is a function that returns HTML. So, we have to create our function. And not only do we have to create our function, we have to export it as well. So, on line 1, we are going to create our function and we are going to export it. So, how do we do that? Export default function recipe. We're going to call it recipe details. Have our brackets, then open this up. Okay, good. This is how we start creating the function. And then autocorrect already tells us what to do. Let's do that for now, but we are going to change this after. So return and then div, because remember, you have to return one root HTML tag over here. Let's just call it recipe details for now. So you probably have noticed something. We have all this code, but nothing is being shown inside the website portion of our page. Why is that? Well, the reason is because, yes, we've just made a component, but this component is not being used anywhere. It's just exported, but it's not being imported or being used anywhere. So where do we import this component and how do we use it? Well, that's where we go back to the app.jfx. The first thing we do here is that we import the new component we just made. So import, exactly, we import recipe details from recipe details. And remember, the only reason we can do this, the only reason why we can import recipe details from recipe details is because inside the recipe details component, we have export default there. So go back here, and now we need to render it. How do we render these new components that we've made? So remember, everything after the return is being rendered. Right now, we are rendering an empty main. And remember how we always have to return one root HTML tag. Right now, the root HTML tag we are returning is main. We could always put things inside it. So if we want to render recipe details, we would want to render it inside the main tag. How would you render it inside the main tag? Well, this is the syntax for it. Recipe details. And then you close it. And boom, there you have recipe details from the recipe details component. So just so you understand what's going over here, recipe details, which is the name that is on the import on line 2, and then you basically treat it like a self-closing HTML tag. You know what self-closing HTML tags are? They're HTML tags where in one line you open and close them. So open and then you put this slash, then you close it. So this is how you use a component inside another component. First you import it and then you basically use it like a self-closing HTML tag. Let's go back to our recipe details and add some more cool things to it. Okay, so the first thing we want to add to our recipe details is that we do not want the recipe details, to just be plain text. We actually want it to be a H1 header. So let's make that H1 header. H1, copy this, H1, and boom, it's bigger. Now it's a H1 header. The next thing we want to do is that, remember, this is going to be a website that shows different recipes, their ingredients, their descriptions, and instructions on how to make them. Well, let's just start with one recipe, and then going forward, we're going to learn how to make multiple of them. So, this recipe details is going to contain the details for one specific recipe. So, let's store the recipe name in a variable. So, const recipe name. Let's say we are making cake. That's the recipe name. Okay, so now the description for the recipe, because every recipe should have a description. So const recipe description equals to, I like how autocorrect already knows what I want to type in. Delicious cake. Delicious cake. I'm going to make this window smaller. This window area smaller because so that my lines don't wrap around easy. Okay, let's, I think, I think this is good enough. And then I'm going to make this one smaller as well. Okay, so now that should be good. So the next thing we want to add is the ingredients for the recipe. Ingredients usually take form of list. So this is the first ingredient, this is the second ingredient, the third ingredient. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a variable const recipe ingredient, and then we're going to have a list. And inside this list, we're going to put all the ingredients for this recipe. I don't know how to make cake, so do not come for me if I'm just going to use the ingredients from autocorrect because autocorrect probably knows how to make cakes better than me. Flour, sugar, eggs, milk. So those are our ingredients. So we have our ingredients, we have our description, we have the recipe name. The next thing we need is the recipe steps. So const recipe steps equals to autocorrect. Please help me again this time. Okay, so it's not going to help me. I'm going to need to. Oh, it did help me. Okay, so mix ingredients, bake in oven. I guess that's it. But then let's do that. Mix ingredients. This time I was smarter than autocorrect. So mix ingredients, preheat the oven because you need to preheat the oven. Preheat oven to 350 degrees. Okay. Bake for 30 minutes. There you go. So we have our recipe, colon. So we have our recipe name, cake, recipe description, a delicious cake, recipe ingredients, flour, sugar, eggs, milk, and recipe steps, mix ingredients, preheat oven to 350 degrees, and bake for 30 minutes. Now we want to display all of those inside our recipe details page. Now this is where it starts to get interesting. This is the fun part. So the first thing we want inside here is the recipe name. So we want every single recipe details card to first start with the recipe name, not recipe details. So we're going to change this from recipe details to the recipe name. And how do you get that recipe name? So the recipe name variable over here, how do you put it inside this H1 tag? That is a very good question. Well, remember, whenever you are trying to put JavaScript variables inside HTML tags, what do? You use the curly brackets. So inside here, you put recipe name. And then watch what happens. We have cake in there. That's very good. So the next thing we want to do is have the recipe description. We're going to put that in a p tag. So just like how we did for the recipe name, all you just need to do is recipe description with the p tag. A delicious cake. Oh, I see I've made an error here. I put this colon, going to delete it, save a delicious cake. So now, what is the next thing we have to do? Well, we have to put a list for the recipe ingredients and then the recipe steps. Before we put that, let's put a header to tell us what each is. This is just going to be plain HTML, no fancy CSS this time. So first we need to know that this header is going to contain the recipe ingredients. So this is going to be simply recipe ingredients, and then make a second one as well, recipe steps. Okay, good. So now we want to display the recipe ingredients and the recipe steps. We're going to display them in an unordered list. So if you remember, ul close. Now this is where it starts to get interesting. Remember the last lesson where we taught you how to loop through values in a list using JSX? That's exactly what we are going to do right here as well. So that's going to be recipe ingredients dot. Do you remember what we're going to do? We're going to do recipe ingredients dot map. And then remember what we're going to do as well. We're going to grab every single ingredient and store it into the variable ingredient. Then what we're going to do is, well, this can be a one-liner. Li, and what should be inside Li? Easy, the ingredient variable. And then you have it, recipe ingredients, flour, sugar, eggs, milk. I hope you remember what this syntax does. This was covered in the GSX video. If you don't remember, please go ahead and watch the GSX video. The link would be posted below. So what we're doing is that we are looping through every ingredient inside the recipe ingredients list, storing the value inside this ingredient variable, and then displaying that value inside an li tag. So that's exactly what this syntax does. We're going to do a very similar thing in the recipe steps. So I'm just going to copy this entire line of code over here because I'm too lazy to type it again. So we're going to have a UL again. Actually, let's go with OL this time. Let's go to an ordered list because just to add some variety. But then this time, we're not looping through. If you look, now it's going to loop through flour, sugar, eggs, milk. We're not looping through that this time. We're looping through our recipe steps. So take the recipe steps, replace this with recipe steps, and that should fix it. So this is good, but it's good to always write code that makes sense. We're looping through the recipe steps list, and then we're calling our variable ingredients. Let's not do that. Let's call our ingredients step. Let's call our variable step. Step, step. So it's code wise, it's the same thing, but then for a human who's reading the code, it makes more sense to say recipe steps dot map step than to say recipe steps dot map ingredient. So there we have it. We have successfully created our recipe details page for each single recipe. We're going to have multiple recipe details for each single recipe. And we made one for a cake recipe, a delicious cake, recipe ingredients, recipe steps. So now I want to drive in the idea that you can put any component inside any other component. So let's look at our recipe details component right now. We have our recipe details and it shows the recipe name, recipe description, recipe ingredients, which is a recipe ingredients H2 tag, and a list of the recipe ingredients and the recipe steps. Well, I think that we can actually make two more components from here. One component is going to contain recipe ingredients, so the header and the list, and then the second component is going to contain recipe steps, the header and the list. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's create two more components, one for each of these recipe details and recipe ingredients rather and recipe steps, and then let's add that to the recipe details page. So just like we did before, src add file. This is going to be called recipe. Let's start with recipe steps. And then remember export default function. What are we going to call it? Recipe steps. Okay. And then return. Right now, let's just make it so it's going to be a div for sure. Inside the div, let's just have our h2 tag that says recipe steps. And then remember, this is going to be exactly what we have in recipe details, but we're making it its own separate component. So we can honestly just go here. So this is going to contain the recipe steps. So you can copy the recipe steps that we have over here, bring them here, make sure it's inside the function. That's our recipe steps. We can go back to recipe details. We can copy over here where we made a list of recipe steps. Go over here, paste that as well. And we've made the component. It's exactly what we have here. So, but what we're going to do now is that we're going to delete this. And we are going to delete this as well. Because we no longer need this anymore. We've made a separate component that shows this. How do we display that second component inside the recipe details component? Well, it's exactly how we did it for the app. We're going to do the exact same thing. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to import dot slash recipe. No, actually, we're going to import recipe steps from colon dot slash recipe steps. So we've imported it. And then what do we do? Easy. We just add it on line 15 or wherever the line before the end of your div, whatever line it says for you. And then we just add recipe steps. And then as a self-closing tag. And then there you go. Now we have the components, recipe steps in here being displayed in here. Let me change it just to show you that yes, it's the components we made, and I'm not just showing you magic. So we just changed it in here, and then you notice that it changed in here as well. Let's delete that. Good. So we've done that for recipe steps. We're going to go ahead and do that for recipe ingredients as well. So come over here, create a new component, recipe ingredients .gsx, export default function recipe ingredients. Okay, come back to details, copy the ingredients because I'm too lazy to type them out again by myself. Bring this closer, copy the ingredients, return. Remember, we have to return a div. It could be anything, but it has to be a root level, one root HTML tag. So we go back here and then we honestly can just copy this entire thing. Recipe ingredients, come over to recipe ingredients, and then we paste it. And then now we have to map. We have to connect recipe ingredients to recipe details. The exact same thing. Import recipe ingredients. There you go. And then copy this name over here. So we can delete this. We don't need that anymore. We can come over here, delete this as well. We don't need that anymore. And then what do we do? Recipe ingredients, self-closing tag. Okay, and then we delete this H2 tag over here. Forgot to delete it. And then there you go. You have the exact same page we had before, but now it's a lot better because we've used multiple components to make the one page. So in the scenario like this, you would say that recipe details is a parent component. And then recipe ingredients and recipe steps, they are child components. Why? Because they are inside the recipe details component. So the next thing I want to teach you in this lesson is React props. In React, props, short for properties, are a way to pass data from one component to another. Typically, this is used to pass data from a parent component to a child component. Think of props as a way for one part of your website to give information to another part. Let us go back to our recipe sharing app REPL. In this REPL, we have our recipe details component, which is the parent component, and we have recipe ingredients and recipe steps, which are child components. So what we are going to do is that we're going to take this recipe ingredients list, we're going to put it in recipe details, and then we are going to pass it down to recipe ingredients as a prop. So how you do that is just copy this, copy it, we come to recipe details, and then we actually paste it. So we're creating the list and we're storing it inside the recipe details. And now we are going to pass recipe ingredients down when we call the recipe ingredients component. So right here on line 12. So how are we going to do it? Well, the first thing we have to do is that we have to think of a name for it. Let's say the name we want to give is just ingredient. Ingredient. And then now, so ingredients is a variable that we've just created. We have to give that variable value. And what value do we want it to be? We want it to be the recipe ingredients list. How do you do that? This and your curly brackets again as well. And then you recipe ingredients. Okay, so we've done that. The page still works the way it works because we still have this as recipe ingredients list over here. But what we are going to do now is that we are going to delete this. And we are going to delete this as well. Yeah, let's delete this as well. Okay, good. Yeah, so we have an empty recipe ingredients page. So now what we want to do is in recipe details, we have passed down the ingredient prop down to the recipe ingredients component. In recipe ingredients, we want to grab that prop that has been passed down. How do you grab the prop? Easy. You do this, yeah, and then inside the curly brackets, you have to put down the name of the prop that was passed down. And recipe ingredients, we pass down the prop ingredients. So in here, we have to grab the prop ingredients. Okay, so now we have grabbed the prop ingredients. So what is ingredients and recipe ingredients? Ingredients and recipe ingredients is the value of ingredients here that was passed in. And what is the value of ingredients here? This list. So just like how we looped through the list in recipe ingredients, we're going to loop through it again inside here. But instead of having recipe ingredients, we can just write down ingredients. So what I'm saying is that in here, we can just do curly brackets, close it, ingredients dot map, grab each individual ingredient, and then display them as a simple li ingredient. There you go. Exactly. So what we've done is that we've passed down the recipe ingredient list as a prop to the recipe ingredient component. And then we grabbed that prop and then we displayed it. We're going to do the exact same thing for recipe steps. So let's come over here, copy the recipe steps, copy recipe details over here, const recipe steps. Let's delete this as well so we can have it empty. Delete this. So now our recipe steps is completely empty as it should be. So we're going to come in here and then we are going to pass in, we're going to call it steps, pass in the steps prop. And inside the steps prop, what are we going to have? We're going to have our recipe steps. So just one thing I want to make sure you understand is that these curly brackets have to be there. If you do this, you're going to get an error. So make sure you use the curly brackets to put in the value of the prop you're passing in. And then we go into recipe steps, and then we grab our steps. Grab our steps, and then we come here, and then what do? Steps dot map, step dot map, step, and then what do we return? Li step, and then recipe steps. There you go. So that is exactly how props are used in React. So everyone, thank you for watching. That is all we have today for our video on components and props in React. And we have successfully built a beautiful page to share recipes. In the upcoming lectures, we're going to add to that page and make it a lot more useful. I hope you understood the concepts that were discussed in this lecture. If you have any questions, please leave them down in the comments. Thank you for watching the video. Stay tuned for more lessons on how to code from Wazobia Code.